Welcome to Secrets of Successful Advisors with Ken Heyman, the podcast where we dive deep into the habits, mindsets, and strategies that set top financial advisors apart. I'm Scott Tatum, and today I'll be talking with Ken to explore his thoughts on the approaches of legacy planning that can sometimes frustrate financial advisors. Before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to an important service from our sponsor, Total Family. For those of you that are working with uniquely successful families and find it difficult for them to frame their thoughts and beliefs about what they believe about getting money to the next generation, you might find Total Family a wonderful tool to help bridge that gap. For more information, go to totalfamily.io. That's totalfamily.io. So, Ken, let's get our listeners in the right frame of mind. You can't delve deeply into the psyche of clients while dwelling in our busy world. So let's leave the outside world behind for 25 minutes and look deep inside human behavior to explore the science of clients, setting instincts aside so that insights can guide. And Ken, we want to guide those insights to an area that frustrates financial advisors again and again. And that is working with successful families in the field of legacy planning. And I think essentially where I want to start this discussion is having that discussion with families happens all the time, right? These advisors are not afraid to have that discussion, but it seems like that process takes an unbelievably long time and that it can really frustrate both the financial advisor and, more importantly, their client. Is there something that you've observed that's at the, just at the very crux of that frustration?
Well, that's a great way of bringing focus to this issue, Scott, because, estate planning is not the same thing as legacy planning. And having the conversation with the family about their legacy is a different conversation than proposing a trust structure or some form of wealth transfer strategy that is, in all likelihood, advisors are more familiar with and more comfortable talking about than the more expansive, the more conceptual issues associated with helping a family define its legacy and then execute on that definition. So if we want to start with an important place for equipping advisors to think differently about these conversations, we need to start with an understanding of the limitations that advisors are bringing to the way they think about wealth transfer and the way those limitations are affecting clients. The fundamental insight to start with is that if you're a uniquely successful family, if you're a husband and wife, originators of wealth that have children and maybe grandchildren, very, very common process. If you read any of Tom Stanley's books, The Millionaire Next Door, who has accumulated wealth, traditionally has more conservative traditional value system. They typically stay in their marriages. They typically have multiple children. Those children proceed in the same set of values. It starts to get complicated. You start to get a whole bevy of humans involved. Unfortunately, as that client matures into those later stages of life, there's no little bell that goes off and no little manual that drops down from the sky that says, oh, you're in this new stage of life, and now we need to think about the management of money differently. In many cases, families wait and delay for a long time as their wealth is accumulated and now is being managed and is now defining the well-being of the family with an ample amount of financial resources. The next steps involved in legacy kind of elude the family. Nothing in their previous experiences leads to this sense of, oh, we know what to do now. And then when they turn to the advisor and introduce this, if the advisor isn't wise enough to introduce it early in the process and say, hey, you're accumulating wealth or you're about to have this major windfall, let's talk a little bit about the legacy vision you have. Let's talk a little bit about what this money means. Let's talk a little bit about what we want and intend for the future. If that isn't introduced by the advisor, and frequently it is not, because the advisor isn't familiar and comfortable with that as much as they're familiar with the conversations around accumulating wealth and the conversations about managing volatility in the markets. That's the everyday stuff. Now they're talking about stuff that isn't everyday, and the family will eventually come and say, hey, we really need to start thinking about this. And this, right at that point, is where things get really interesting from a psychological perspective. Because what I've observed, Scott, is that the advisor assumes there's two options for what to do with this money. Now let's assume it's a very uniquely successful family, 20, 30, 40 millions of dollars. Let's assume the money is going to extend out into the future beyond the boundaries of the originator's lives. It's going to massively impact the next generation and could potentially massively impact the generation after that and the generation after that. So we have this substantial amount of wealth. And the advisor's entire history, and it's really important to understand the nuances here psychologically. The advisor's entire history has been building a relationship with the originator of the wealth. If the advisor is very smart and unusual, building a relationship with the spouse, that's kind of job one in terms of managing these families. Spouses are not going to have the same value system. So there are going to have to be two types of relationship. The advisor, the prudent advisor, connects with both of them. But here's the thing. Even if the advisor is wise enough to connect with both spouses, which is not necessarily common, the advisor brings an assumption that money is controlled by an individual. And so when you put that filter or that framework on top of wealth transfer, here's what you get. You get a limited mindset that frustrates everyone, because in that limited mindset, there's such a constraint that the family can't actually accomplish what they're trying to accomplish in terms of legacy. Now, let me unpack that just a little bit more. If your assumption is somebody has to control this money is in the hands of a person, a decision maker. Well, one of your options is, well, when it comes to wealth transfer, the process is letting the originator release control of the money and handing the money off to the next generation. It's the most common thing you see. Said, well, we made this 20 millions of dollars. We have two kids. Each kid is going to get half of it. We're not totally sure one of the kids is ready to do that. We're very concerned about their value system. We don't really want them to go out and just start buying stuff and enjoying life and squander this wealth. But we haven't spent much time with these kids in terms of installing a value system. But what the heck, we're just going to release it and hand it off and hope for the best in the future. No consideration for generations to come, no consideration about what kind of values will inform this. It's a very frustrating moment because the feeling is, well, we need to let this go and move on. And, our life is coming to a close and they get to move on and do what they want with it. Well, for someone who has spent a lifetime...
It was my money. Right. It was my money. Now it's going to be someone else's money. And then maybe it will become someone else's money, but I don't know. All I know, it was my money and now it's someone else's money.
And you are exactly right. And the problem with that psychologically, Scott, is human beings hate uncertainty, and all they can see in the future is uncertainty. In many cases, the kids grow up, and you see this frequently when there's conflict around inheritance, that the kids grow up and it's like, yeah, that's my money. Mom and dad made it. They sold the business, but that's my money, and I'm waiting for my money to come downstream to me. It's the most common thing you see in these families. And so, because the advisor's operating with an impoverished sense of choices, the assumption is, well, that's what we have to do, and we'll hope for the best. But humans hate that uncertainty. And the originators are looking and saying, all right, so a lifetime of effort, a lifetime of sacrifice, a lifetime of risk, a lifetime of good fortune that has come home to roost in a big way, and I'm going to watch my kids drive really fancy cars and live in really nice houses, and that's the reward that I can expect going forward. And maybe the grandkids will have something to enjoy later in life. It's a terrible option, but it's the most common option that's expressed. There is an alternative. It's not as common, and it's equally frustrating because in many cases, the family that originates the wealth, the part of the family that originates the wealth, says, well, we're not confident the kids are going to do a good job with this. We're very concerned about expressing our values going forward. We want the grandkids to receive something, and so we're going to control it from the grave. And so our estate planning process is to create all these constraints and definitions to ensure that the spouse is taken care of as if they're a dependent, that the control of the money will continue to be controlled by the originator. Then the next generation is going to be controlled by the originator, and the generation after that. And what happens is, well, at least the originator says there's some certainty here. I've controlled for outcomes like I did all through my business life. I've controlled for outcomes. I've been the big decision maker. I will continue to be the decision maker from the grave. Now, for the originator, that can feel relieving because at least it's reducing uncertainty. But for the rest of the family, it's debilitating because they never get to grow up into the sense of ownership and responsibility, the development of their own values and their competency. They're infantilized by that decision. And so when you look at estate planning and you absent the idea of the family grappling with their legacy, you get these two options. Option one, frustrating because of the uncertainty. Option two, frustrating because of the control. This is a dreadful state for a family to end up in, and yet it's almost inevitable they will. Why is that? Because the advisor doesn't understand there's a third option available, but it's not part of their usual set of tools.
So, Ken, what you've done is not just explain those two options, but you've explained that sense of frustration because it is that uncertainty that creates that agonizing death march to some kind of completion in option one. And it's trying to figure out how I'm going to anticipate what I need to control generations in the future that creates such a delay and drama in option two. And since those are both really frustrating and frustrating for the advisor because they're so hard, it takes so much effort to get to an unsatisfying conclusion, we need the third option.
Well, we do need the third option, and that third option is a little bit complicated to explain, but hopefully upon an explanation, the vision of what it could mean for a family can kind of solidify in the mind of the advisor, and the advisor can move forward with a better option, the third option, which is to first and foremost for the advisor to realize that the client is no longer the originator of the wealth. And this is a big jump for the advisor to take. The advisor is used to working one-on-one with somebody. But at a certain point in the process, a lot sooner than most families and most advisors are aware of, the client of the advisor is actually the family, not the originator and the spouse, but the originator and the spouse and the next generation and the next generation and generations yet unborn. It is the family and its ability to function and make decisions across multiple generations well into the future. That entity, the system of the family, becomes the client. And so if the advisor can make that step and begin working with the originators around the legacy vision they have, and can begin working with the next generation around the legacy vision they have, and can begin to establish with multiple generations a participating process in defining the legacy that the family is pursuing that will define that family's sense of well-being and the use of this money out into future generations. If the advisor sees that as the task, you create this third option, which is no longer the money is handed off to the next generation. Now it's our money, or now it's my money. And it's no longer, I need to control what's happening from the grave for the originator. Now, what can happen is the family across multiple generations can create a process that continuously elevates the value system and the decision making skills of each generation so that the family can transition this wealth responsibly as stewards of this wealth from generation to generation to generation. Now, there's structures and legal entities and governance processes that have to be established. But the essence of this strategy and the essence of what this means is that the family understands that its task is not the control of this money, but is in the development of good decision-making skills that it can exercise over and over again, and that can adapt to situations and conditions as things happen in the future that cannot be anticipated. Now, that is the general overview. There's more specifics to it, and I think we need to look at those specifics a little bit more. But the idea here is that we're transitioning from a mindset of we're working with the originator of the money to manage the money to we're working with this entire family at different stages of values, clarity, and decision-making development so that the family evolves and matures and transitions from generation to generation with an organizing principle that continuously calls the next generation to a higher, clearer, more stewardship-oriented type of thinking. So this idea of control shifts from controlling this money on my agenda to controlling this money on a larger agenda that represents the interests of many people across many generations. That's the essence of the general strategy, Scott.
And it strikes me that advisors focus when they focus on estate planning, not legacy planning. They focus on that stuff you mentioned. They focus on, as I understand that they do, on the trust documents and the wills and what are we going to do to eliminate estate taxation. And that's the deliverable. But that's what's so frustrating because it can be so hard to get to the deliverable. If you're able to make that mind shift from who's going to control it and where does the control happen and what constraints do I need to put in place to keep that control? If it goes from it's my money to it's money that we're all trying to make good decisions around, that barrier to getting documents drafted, documents now just become a prescription. I mean, I can't see that is going to be nearly the agonizing process that it often is for advisors. So what would you say are the first steps to getting that mind shift in place? Because it's a third option. It is not one that most advisors are really familiar or comfortable with now.
So the first step is to understand that the client is now the family and that the engagement of the practice is not simply with the originators who are quote unquote controlling the wealth, but with the family that's going to have to manage this wealth and answer the question, what do we want this money to be doing 100 years from now, 200 years from now? Those questions are all about legacy. They're not about estate planning per se, they're about legacy. What are our values? What does this money mean? How do we want this money to be invested for the well-being of this family? If we value education, maybe this money is primarily going to be ensuring the educational needs of multiple generations going forward. It may be something, have something to do with creativity. It may be, have something to do with security. There's lots of different legacies that families may value. But here's the thing. It's not about getting to the structures. It's about starting with clarification of values. So that process starts then with looking at the originators, the originator of the wealth and the spouse, and say, okay, what's your value system? What are the things that matter most to you? What drove the creation of this wealth? And how are your values similar and how are your values different? And what do you have as a vision for what this money could mean for the family going forward? See, the originators have been looking at their kids and looking at their grandchildren and have been imposing on them a vision in their own mind of what they would love to see true for them. And of course, the kids went in their own direction, but the grandparents, now the parents, the grandparents, the great grandparents have a vision and a value they want to see. Now, what needs to happen then is for that vision to become solidified and for them to be able to talk about it and for them to be able to share that vision downstream to the next generation. So we think about this idea of getting vision clarified, getting values clarified, and then maybe starting to write a series of letters that simply expresses the values and vision that informed the creation of this wealth. Now, here's where it gets really powerful psychologically, Scott. And here's where the advisor has this tremendous amount of influence and actually becomes the permanent, irreplaceable resource for the family. When the advisor's thinking, the family is my client. Because what happens next is the advisor can invite the family to start to have a dialogue. The next generation can be invited to clarify their values. What are your values? Now, I want you to think about the implication here. The originators of the wealth take some time and clarify their values. What created the wealth? What drove the wealth? That information is passed to the next generation and inspires the next generation, informs the next generation. And then they're asked to clarify their values. And maybe for the first time, they have to shift their thinking from, oh, I can't wait till I get this money so I can do what I want to do with it, to a question about the larger set of values that informs decision making. If mom and dad clarified the values that inform their decision making, that can inspire the kids to take a larger view of things. And especially if you put it in the context of the next generation downstream, suddenly that second gen that didn't create the wealth is invited into a mindset they've never been in before, which is the mindset of stewardship and the mindset of, well, what are our values that we want to express going forward? And now you can invite the next gen after that to do the same thing. You can have 3 generations talking about their values. And the place you do that is in family meetings. The family meeting is the expression of these visions, these values, these ideas about the future, then being discussed, and the family learning how to have a conversation about values and vision. The originators are great at values and vision. They can invite the next generation up into that conversation, and we can start talking about what is the legacy that we want to hand down and want to manage on behalf of the family. That's the third option, for the advisor to help the family develop the muscles, develop the competency to make these decisions, to have these conversations, to see the wealth as a resource for the family going forward, to attach that wealth to the values that the family wants to support and encourage going forward. And importantly, to invite everyone into a much more powerful and functional mindset around this wealth and the well-being of the family as something that they're taking responsibility for. So what happens? Well, the origination generation and the next generation work with the advisor to create the structures and the governance of how this is going to be moved forward. But it's not controlled from the grave. It's a dynamic process where the originating generation hands the process off at an appropriate time to the next generation. And then eventually, of course, they pass, and now the next generation assumes their role of responsibility. The process of the third option for these families enables the family to grow into the competency they need for this to become a multi-generational, many generational process of preserving, stewarding, and using this wealth for appropriate purposes in the future. It's a completely different mindset, Scott. It has everything to do with fulfilling legacy, but it's a different way of thinking about estate planning.
And You did a beautiful job, I think, getting into a psychological reason of why our traditional approach to estate planning has been so unsatisfying and so, I think, frustrating for both financial advisors and their clients. And that if we can set aside option one or option two and open our mind to option three, not only are you going to have a much richer relationship with those current clients, but it's going to be such a unique approach. It should lead to just wonderful things for your practice. So, as our listeners return to their busy world of running their practices, let me remind you that we would love ideas for future podcasts. If you've got something you want Ken to discuss, just go to Ken's LinkedIn page or my LinkedIn page and leave us an idea. If we use it, we will be happy to give you a shout out on the podcast. That's a wrap for this edition of Secrets of Successful Advisors with Ken Heyman, the podcast where we explore the science of clients, setting instincts aside so that insights can guide.